Attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this Academy update webinar from James Cooper Kreston. It's one of a regular series. I'm glad to say we have a decent number of people on the webinar, despite the challenging weather conditions that we hear about. As I look out the window here, we're actually based in Reading today, sunshine and no snow whatsoever. So my name is Mike Farwell. I'm head of James Cooper Kreston's Charities and Education team, and I'm joined today by Darren O'Connor, who's head of our Academies team. Both of us work with lots of academies. So this is a session on the Kreston Academies benchmarking report for 2018. Hopefully, those of you on the call will have either received an email with a link to the report or a hard copy. The good news is it's not essential that you've looked at the report by now, but hopefully this webinar will stimulate some activity subsequently in terms of looking at some of the detail. On your screens, you will have a facility to ask any questions that you might have, and we'll deal with those at the end. The plan is for the session to last for around 30 minutes or so. So in terms of the structure of the session, we'll be looking mainly at the Kreston Academy's benchmarking report for 2018, now in its 7th year. Along the way, we'll also cover some other sector issues, partly as we cover the benchmarking report, but in the second half we'll also consider a few things separately. So these will include, for example, MultiAcademy Trusts, pensions and governance issues. So if we start with the benchmark report highlights, as I've just said, this webinar is due to last around 30 minutes. If you've only got 2 minutes time, in the next 2 minutes I will highlight what some of the key findings are, but we do hope that you will stay with us for the full duration. So I think it's fair to say that there's not a great deal of good news in these highlights, but important to understand the position in any case. So the National Audit Office is estimating that academies need to make £3 billion of savings in the next 2 years. Income per pupil is falling, capital funding is falling. There's now 55% of academies in deficit, and we'll look at that in a bit more detail later. It's quite clear that financial governance is very important in these challenging times, and I think, as I'm sure many of you will be aware, there is a move towards more multi-academy trust centralisation, which may of course generate cost savings. More of that later. In terms of other key stats, the pupil-teacher ratio is gradually rising. Interesting to see that the average numbers of trustees is down, and we may speculate on some of the reasons for that later. Around 72% of costs at academies are on staffing. No great surprise there, but a few changes to talk to you about and a few particular issues. In terms of non-staff costs, I think there are probably limited amounts to cut there. Quite a few savings have already been made. It's apparent that there is a pensions time bond, which obviously links in with staff costs. And the alarmist is suggesting that reserves within the sector could run out in 2 to 3 years. So hard to say that this is all a very positive picture, but potentially benchmarking might help you deal with some of these challenges. So just a bit of brief background about the benchmark report. It's prepared by the Kreston Group. We're one of approximately 10 other similar firms across the country acting for a huge number of academies. So the report is based on around 600 academies across the country, around 50 multi-academy trusts, based upon the August 2017 accounts that you will have submitted by the 31st of December. The data in the report is analysed by primary, secondary, multi-academy trusts, and there is a bit of regional data there. So it can often be useful to compare your own academy to the averages. We're very aware that in some regions, some sort of mini benchmarking has been done with perhaps 4 or 5 other academies where there are some similarities. And I think one of the key things about benchmarking is that it does help stimulate thought, makes you think about how you do things, and at its least, I suppose, it can also give you some reassurance that at least others have got the same problems as you. So we're now going to have a little bit of audience participation. So the question should be appearing on your screen. So relatively straightforward. You've got four options. Have you A, successfully used benchmarking, B, used it with limited success, 3, not used it at all but considering it, or 4, think it's a waste of time. If you choose that latter option, I'm not quite sure why you're on the webinar, but let's see. So I'll give you a few minutes to answer that. So the responses are coming in. Just give you 1 or 2 more minutes. So, okay, I'll close the poll now. So around about 2/3 have used it with limited success. A third not used it at all. Delighted to say there's nobody on the call who thinks it's a waste of time. But equally, very little in terms of academies saying that they've successfully used it. So I think clearly there's an interest in benchmarking, a bit of use, but more can be done. So thank you for that. So we'll move on at the main constituent parts of the benchmarking report. So look at income for the first one. I think we know that there are pressures on income, reduced income per pupil. We're seeing reduced educational services grants, SEN and capital funding. I think it's fair to say that whilst there has been much talk in the sector about generating non-educational income, as perhaps the independent school sector has done, there's little sign of that happening in the academy sector. I mean, I think the vast bulk of it revolves around secondary schools that have perhaps got some facilities that can be used by local communities. The much heralded national funding formula doesn't appear to have had a great deal of impact. Obviously, I don't think it's generated any additional funding, but a few regional tweaks. There is a bit more in terms of academies successfully managing to negotiate grants either with the ESFA or with local authorities, particularly in the context of failing schools where there may be some cash flow issues due to falling pupil rolls. And we've also seen a few cases where people have been able to obtain funding based on estimated numbers. I think, as many of you are aware, that the funding for academies is generally based on past pupil numbers, but there have been some situations where funding based on estimated numbers has been obtained in situations where there is fairly significant growth in pupil numbers. So I think in these types of situations, it's always worth perhaps considering having these types of discussions. And if you do get into these discussions, it's important to get your best negotiators on board because there are no specific rules around this type of funding. In terms of parental contributions, which is something that we have talked about in previous reports, I know that some schools are not at all keen on asking for parental contributions other than for things like school trips. I think we have seen a significant increase in the number of schools that are asking for parental contributions towards core school costs. Can be quite useful. But it does vary a great deal. Worth mentioning that in these situations there are some tax benefits in terms of gift aid, which can be used to enhance the amounts that you would actually receive. So here are the numbers. We've looked at a 3-year trend. So you'll see that in primary and secondary, it's not surprising the trend has been downwards. Interesting to see that MultiAcademy Trust is up slightly. Hard to interpret what that actually means, but I think it's clear both from these numbers and anecdotally that funding pupil is reducing. So in terms of staff costs, average of 72% of total costs. Some schools it may be as high as 80%. Interestingly, this year not a great deal of variation between primary, secondary, and multi-academy trusts. They all come in at 72%, whereas there was a bit more variation in the previous year. Interesting also, we've got some data around pupil-teacher ratios, and you'll see from the data there that pupil-teacher ratios are on the increase, particularly for secondary schools and multi-academy trusts. I think it's perhaps fair to say that for primary schools this may be harder to achieve. There's perhaps less scope in terms of curriculum changes, that perhaps a secondary or a multi-academy trust can make. So I think it will be interesting to keep this data under review over a number of years to see what the implications are. I suppose the spark money will be on the ratio increasing again into the future. So in terms of some of the issues that we've seen with staff costs, we've mentioned the pupil-teacher ratios. There's a lot more restructuring costs that we're seeing in the accounts of academies, so perhaps where the academy is reshaping its workforce leading to perhaps some redundancies and settlement agreements, looking at perhaps bringing in junior and slightly less expensive staff. There's a bit of a move, I think, towards reduced non-teaching staff, but not necessarily dramatic change there. I think, there are some issues around recruitment of newly qualified teachers, which are likely to create issues over a number of years. In terms of national scales, I think, pretty much everyone is using those scales, and I think only 6% in our survey suggested that we consider coming off the scales. So we'll wait to see whether that changes into the future. And finally, there is some data in the report around head CEO salaries. That's been in the news again recently. And we've also got some data in the report around school business managers. Not surprisingly, one of the trends there is the bigger the number of pupils at the school, the higher the salaries for those the different roles. In terms of non-staff costs, I think the question arises as to whether there is scope for more savings. Some savings have been made, so it may be limited. Some of you will be aware that the DOP launched a schools buying strategy a little while ago. Perhaps worth a read some of the documentation around that. They're aiming for some quite ambitious savings of around £1 billion. Potential savings around MultiAcademy Trusts and some centralisation, but little evidence of massive savings being made there at the moment. I think disturbingly, and this is perhaps not particularly surprising, only 26% of academies felt that they were keeping up to date with maintenance and capital issues on property, equipment, etc. And I think we all know that that's likely to store up a problem into the future. In terms of insurance risk protection arrangements, the take-up there has increased. It's nearly running at 50% and some significant savings. And I think we're seeing much more focus on better procurement, so academies looking at buying in bulk or possibly joint purchasing with other academies. So moving on to surpluses and deficits, this is always a hard one to interpret in academies because of depreciation. I think broadly we're working on the principle of pre-depreciation deficits. Often in academies there are huge depreciation charges for land and buildings. So based upon the August 17 accounts, we see that 55% of academies made a deficit. Now that is a dramatic rise over the last 2 years. The figure was only 1 and 5, 21% in 2015, 42% last year. So that is quite alarming and obviously can't go on forever. 80% of academies have deficits after depreciation is taken into account. And I think it's fair to say that where academies are making deficits, they're tending to be larger than they used to be, and if they're making surpluses, they're generally smaller. So we've got some data there about primary, secondary, and multi-academy trust. Deliberately chosen the comparative from 2 years ago rather than from last year, just so you can see the move. So some really significant changes in all three categories, either very significantly reduced surpluses or, in the primary school case, turning a surplus into a deficit. So this, of course, leads to some tough decisions. For example, and one potential solution some would consider would be joining a multi-academy trust, and perhaps of particular relevance to primaries where the take-up of academies has been much smaller, but yet 74% of academies are running at a deficit. So another bit of audience participation here. Do you think becoming a member of a multi-academy trust will help your academy generate more income or reduce costs? So relatively straightforward in terms of the answers, either yes, no, or don't know. So if you can vote in the next few seconds, that would be great. Just give you a few more minutes. Okay, so I think we'll close the poll now. So some quite interesting answers there. So 20% of you think that being a member of a MAT will generate some financial benefits, but around 30% think it won't generate benefits, and over 40% don't know. So it's quite interesting. There's no clear picture there as to whether multi-academy trust status will generate financial benefit. So thank you for your votes there. So we'll just move on to my last slide before I hand over to Darren. So we'll look at cash balances and reserves. So we show here on this slide the average cash balances and what's called free reserves. I won't get into the definitions of what that means, but broadly it means unrestricted. So you'll see there that cash balances, not surprisingly, I think, given the deficits, are on the decline. So you'll see primary schools, it's down from 234 to 163. Secondary, there's also a decline. And in terms of multi-academy trusts, I think there's a slight typo in that slide. The figure for 2017 should actually be 716 rather than 7617. So again, a significant reduction of over 300,000 from the previous year. So some academies very low balances, perhaps looking to the ESFA for support. Again, it brings out the key around financial discipline and monitoring, and also cash flow management, and the need to look at levels of reserves, etc. Of all the academies in our benchmarking report, the total deficits ran to around 100 million, and the reserves are around 240 million. So, if you were being alarmist and looking on the bleak side, you might argue that in somewhere between 2 and 3 years' time, the academy sector will run out of reserves. So on that positive and exciting note, I will now hand over to Darren, who I'm sure will have great news about issues such as pensions and governance. Darren.
Thanks very much, Mike, and I'll try. Firstly, pensions. Just as a brief reminder, there's 2 pension schemes that are relevant to academies. We have the local government pension scheme and the teachers' pension scheme. Although they're both defined benefit schemes, meaning that their final salary, the way they are treated is slightly different due to subtle differences between the 2 funds and schemes. On the local government pension scheme, as it is a funded scheme, you essentially bring the deficit or surplus onto the balance sheet, whereas the teachers' pension scheme is an unfunded, i.e. there isn't a pot set aside for the pension liability, and therefore the balance or the deficit does not feature on your balance sheet. So taking local government pension scheme first, there is some good news. On average, our survey suggests that the closing deficit is lower than it was last year. Reasons for the decrease is mainly around actuarial assumptions and in particular the discount rates used. But unfortunately, that's really where the good news ends. The actual contribution rates paid by academies has actually increased on average, and that is the real cost year on year. So unfortunately, bad news here as well. We did notice that there was significant disparity across the sector in terms of contribution rates. This is something the government and the ESFA have recognised. There is a movement, perhaps only a small movement, but given that income is being harmonised or supposedly harmonised as a result of the national funding formula, is there scope going forward for harmonising the rates of contribution as well? We've got a long way to go here, and we'll see how that pans out over the next few years. Moving on to the teachers' pension scheme, as I mentioned, this is not reflected on your balance sheet. We know as a result of recent reviews carried out that contribution rates will increase. They will go up from the 16.4 that we currently see. The most recent guidance is somewhere between 18 and 20%. That is a significant increase. To give you an idea, that for a typical or traditional secondary school, that could lead to an increase of around 50,000 to perhaps 100,000 in contributions a year, so a significant amount. The table on the bottom right hand side there just represents the current burden that teachers' pension scheme is having on schools, academies, and you'll see year on year across all the different types an increasing burden. Moving on to governance, and Mike has already mentioned the importance of governance going forward, and it is an area that the ESFA have been focusing on in the past year or two. Many of the accounting officer letters have focused in this area. The key is to hold leadership to account, and this is even more important in maths, where there can be some complex structures in place and differing levels of both governing body structure and also the leadership structure. And therefore it's very important to ensure that your governance model is clear and concise. The ESFA have recognised this, and last year did issue the Governance Handbook. Admittedly, this is a very long read at over 131 pages, and our survey would suggest that the take-up or the awareness from governors is low in this area. On a more positive note, governors do seem to be aware of the Academy's financial handbook and the requirements within that document. Mainly the musts that an academy must comply with. It's worth noting that year on year the musts seem to be increasing, and there is an increasing burden from a governance point of view. As part of our benchmark report, we asked academies, have they carried out a governance review within the past year? 60% on a positive note said they had, but 40% clearly have not. Governance reviews are very important to ensure that trustees and governors clearly understand their roles and responsibilities and the mechanisms that are in place to ensure good governance continues. As I've already mentioned, the financial handbook does seem to increase in terms of its level of requirements year on year, and perhaps this is one of the reasons why it is becoming increasingly difficult to find volunteers to take a position on a board at a local academy. It's not just the number of governors, but also the composition in terms of their experience, and we're finding more and more there is a skills gap that has been identified at a number of academies. You'll see there at the bottom the average board size, and I think this carries on the same theme. You'll see that across primary, secondary and maths that the board size is reducing year on year. Interestingly, maths being the biggest type, or in most cases maths being the biggest type of academy, has the smallest board. I suppose there's various reasons for that. Perhaps having a streamlined board allows decisions to be made quickly and effectively, but we must bear in mind that across that, the cross-section and composition of the board, relevant skills do need to be met, whether that be finance, legal, HR, just to name a few. Moving on to multi-academy trusts, it's clear from the table at the bottom that maths are on the rise. We have seen that single academies, or SATs, have not reduced significantly during the year. So presumably that means that all newly converted academies are finding a home either in existing maths or are setting up a mat with local academies that are converting at the same time. There are also a number of what are called empty mats, and these are mats that are set up under a mat structure but only include one school. Presumably these schools are gearing up to grow over time and take on newly converted or other academies within the sector. Worth noting now a few more stats, that 64% of secondary schools are now academies, and 26% of all primaries are academies. So it's clearly a trend towards academisation. Staying with multi-academy trusts, the regional schools commissioners are clearly in support of maths, and particularly with schools that are perhaps failing to meet targets, both from an educational and a financial perspective, are being politely asked, and in some cases coerced, into joining multi-academy trusts. So this will put pressure on maths over time, as they will need to support some of the failing schools or the schools that are below the desired threshold, and help turn them around over time. And as I say, clearly maths will need to ensure that resources are held and set aside to make sure this can occur. One area of funding is the RAGF, the Regional Academy Growth Fund, which within 16 to 17 there was 30 million of funds accessed by MATs that were growing to help support the type of scenario that I just mentioned there. With growing MATs, clearly due diligence is very important, ensuring that you were very aware of the risks you were taking on, as well as the assets and the positive aspects. I won't go into too much detail on due diligence, as we have recently presented a webinar purely on due diligence, which is available on our website. Finally, they're funding central services. As part of MAT, there is clearly some services that are central. So these are trust-specific costs, and perhaps your CEO or your CFO and so on. In terms of top slicing, that's a term that's used. Essentially, it's the top slice that's put aside out of your GAG and mainstream income to fund the central service. We've got a graph there at the bottom right, and you'll see that overwhelmingly 5% seems to be the top slice percentage, with 4% coming in second place. It just gives you an idea of what other MATs are currently using, and there will be a PR and marketing piece going forward for growing MATs when trying to take on other academies and what top slice they are proposing to charge. So moving to other sector issues, there's been a recent letter from Lord Agnew, which was in the recent e-bulletin. Lord Agnew represents DFE, and he advocates the autonomous school system, meaning the academisation process. He reiterates the importance of the chair, and the chair's focus should be on financial health and sustainability of the trust. Within his letter, he does include some useful resources, such as national deals on energy and printing and so on, which is worthwhile looking at, and there's links to the relevant websites. He also touches on the importance of value for money and the requirements that all academies should take seriously, and also does touch on the justification of higher paid individuals and their salaries. And I think there will be a movement further down the road here for the ESFA to question some of the larger salaries paid within academies. The Dear Accounting Officer letters, there's been a number during the year, or during 2017. The most recent was in December 2017, and that was prepared by Eileen Miller, the new CEO of the ESFA. The letter broadly covered off a reminder of deadlines, but also made it clear that going forward there is going to be a degree of naming and shaming, and a list provided of late offenders, so to speak. So a reminder of the next deadline coming up is the budget forecast, and the deadline for that is the 18th of May of this year. Finally, there on our list we have associate membership of the MultiAcademy Trust. This is a new alternative structure from your traditional MultiAcademy Trust, where schools or academies can join MultiAcademy Trust on a slightly more flexible approach, and it doesn't have all the legal complications of joining a MAT. So this will allow you to test the water, perhaps for a period up to 2 years, which is deemed as a transitional period, before deciding whether you want to formally join the MultiAcademy Trust or not. We recently published an article on associate memberships, and that is on our website if you would like further details on this proposed alternative structure. So I'll now hand back to Mike to summarise, and then we will take questions.
Thanks very much, Darren. Interesting to see that MultiAcademy Trust joining the type of techniques that a golf club might use, and having associate membership for a period to try before you buy. We'll see how successful that one is. So we've had a couple of questions that have come in during the webinar. The first one, what do you think the best way is to find new trustees? Darren, do you have any comments on that?
Yes, well, I suppose as a bit of background, it is becoming ever increasingly difficult to find volunteers, given the responsibilities that the trustees do take on. But to answer the question, how to find trustees, well, there's the more traditional, conventional means of advertising in local papers, the school bulletin or newsletter, and via the internet. But then other schools are starting to look to retired professionals who want to keep their hand in and perhaps have some more time on their hands. There's also formal bodies such as the ICAW who do publish a list of willing volunteers. You can also consult your peers, other trustees, to see if they know of anyone who would like to become a member of the trust board. So hopefully that answers the question there.
Okay, thanks very much, Darren. And the other question we've had in was how much will joining the risk protection arrangement save me in insurance? The answer to that question is that it will very much depend on specific circumstances. But looking at the figures that we had in the benchmark report, I think the average for schools within the RPA was about 35,000, and those insuring on the general market was 53. So potentially quite a big saving, although it may well be that some of the schools on the general market would be the slightly bigger schools. So definitely worth exploring if you haven't already done so. So I think that's broadly it from us. On that final page there, you'll see our contact details. If you have any burning questions that you'd like to get in touch with us after the webinar, you'll see some useful links to the benchmarking report and various other things. The webinar will be available on our website for anyone who enjoyed it so much that they'd like to see it again, or perhaps more likely want to forward it to one of your colleagues. So it just remains for me to thank you very much for joining us, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you.